Hey everybody, welcome back to Spacecast. I'm Josh. I'll be your host for today and every day. Today we're doing an episode following up on a webinar that Austin did last week. So to my left I have Cody Short. He is a software developer that leads up the development of SDK Astrogator. Next to him is Austin Claybrook. Austin designed, painstakingly rebuilt the Apollo 11 mission using SDK Astrogator, and he did a webinar on that, how to do it, about a week ago, and he's going to be showing us some more stuff. A lot of questions came up during the webinar that we weren't able to get to, so we're going to go through some of those now. And added bonus is Chief Astrodynamicist, Dr. Jim Woodburn over there on the far side, and he's going to be adding in some color commentary as Austin and Cody go back through some of the things that came up in the discussion during the webinar. So welcome, guys. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Again, yeah, right. It was a very popular webinar. We had, like I said, lots of questions. We ran out of time, and we had already gone over an hour. So Cody's got the list printed out here of all the stuff that we're going to go back over. So Cody, why don't you go ahead and get started and ask the questions.
Sure. So I think rather than just kind of read through them one at a time, that sounds like it might be a little bit boring. I'm going to give you some prompt questions.
Okay.
We'll
There you go.
So the actual question here was, how long did it take you to create the simulation? But can you just describe your process and length of time? And
So I was when I first started my full-time role here at AGI, it would be right around the 1st of February of last year, so 2018. I think about a week or so after that, I was given the task of rebuilding the Apollo mission. And the timeline for that was try to get it mostly ready by December, so that the next couple months we'd have time to clean it up, make it tidy scenario for the 50th anniversary on July 20th of this year. So I started back in February of last year. So at this point, it's been about a year and 4 or 5 months, about a year and 4 months or so. But I didn't work on it the entire time. I would say most of the time I put into this was going and like researching and finding what actually happened during the mission, learning the different phases of the mission, finding different data. There's lots of qualitative sources, but there's not that many accurate quantitative sources, or these actual numbers of the burns or how, like the direction they pointed in. So I found what I could and built it from there. So I'd say figuring out what they actually did, what took the longest. Building this scenario took a little while too. In the upcoming weeks, we're going to be holding some training. We're going to rebuild the trajectory. There's going to be 3 one-hour trainings for that. So if you wanted to rebuild the trajectory from start to finish, you could probably do it in less than a day to get all the details. What really took so long is getting all the actual numbers they hit, opposed to modeling and setting it up.
Right, and I think a part of the reason it took you so long is because you were trying to match so perfectly, versus just getting to the moon and doing a mission that generally resembled it. That's not what you did. You went painstaking, looked at the numbers, and said, that's slightly off. Let me match everywhere I can.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Josh. If we just wanted to get to the moon and circle it, we could do that in minutes.
Right. And did you also hit situations where you had potentially gaps in time that you had to figure out what to do, as opposed to like saying having exquisite information to follow along with every step of the way?
Yeah, so I can show you my primary data source for most of this. One was the Apollo 11 mission report, which is down here. Let me get to the right page. It's right around here. Most of what I went off of is this table. It's a typewritten table from 1969. Here we go. So this is mostly when I went off of. Oops. There we go. So these are the typewritten numbers, and throughout this process, I found errors in the original typewritten data. That's, again, probably someone just, mistyped something. But there were discrepancies in the data, and I couldn't always match these values. I definitely had to put some tolerances on the values I met, but I could usually match like latitude, longitude within like 0.1 degrees or so, and feet within, a couple feet per second. and then the miles, which are the altitude, which they give in nautical miles. I can usually match that within a couple 100 feet or so. So I was able to hit it throughout most of the trajectory pretty well. There were a few occasional spots I could highlight that I couldn't hit exactly, but it was still pretty close.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that, when we define things like latitude and longitude, right now for the moon we would be using something called the mean Earth frame, which I'm not sure was even defined at that point in time. So their latitude longitude references may be slightly different than what we would use today.
I believe that's another big cause of the reason why I couldn't hit the values exactly. For example, I know they used a reference geoid sometime around the 1967 was the reference they mentioned. We didn't have that in SDK, and we have something similar called the B1950, which is what I use to not for the geoid itself, but the coordinate frames. I use that because if I use the moon inertial or the moon ICRF, there was a 20-30 degree offset between the two, and it turns out that the B1950 was much closer to. I was able to match those values much more closely than if I tried to use the moon ICRF frame or a different frame like that. So I had to use. There's a bunch of different coordinate frames as well as geoid references discrepancies in the Apollo 11 document themselves. They actually mentioned that there were discrepancies between the trajectory data and the landing data. So they have discrepancies themselves. So I had to try to resolve all that. One thing I found after starting was the altitude of the moon. Their reference was about 1 nautical mile off from the one that we use by default. So it's just by the nature of what altitude is your zero altitude. That gave me some trouble at first.
How often would you need to update gravity models for the higher order gravity effects? Every 1,000 years, every 100 years? What do you think that?
Well, I think the big problem was, that with the moon, we didn't have good gravity fields at the time of Apollo. And it takes a long time to develop a good gravity field for the moon because of the fact that the moon is orientation-wise tidally locked with the Earth. So we always see the same face of the moon. So for our spacecraft even orbiting the moon, it takes an entire month for that spacecraft to basically see the whole surface of the moon. And so, you need to sample all over the place to get a good gravity field. And these Apollo missions, they weren't that long. They weren't doing that. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, you need really good tracking data, which obviously tracking systems today are much more advanced and all. So the gravity fields that they were dealing with, were probably very, very crude, probably led to a lot of uncertainty in the orbit solution, and especially during propagation as to where you were going to end up. So, more recently we've had the Grail mission, which has given us just exquisite gravity on the moon, even better than what we have on the Earth or anywhere else in the solar system. They've developed 1,200 by 1,200 fields for the gravity of the moon, which is about a 5-kilometer resolution at the surface, which is fantastic. Mm-hmm. But certainly way, way different than what existed back in the Apollo days.
Once you know the gravity field that well, too, to kind of answer your question, I don't think you need to update that very frequently once you know the mass distribution
Sure.
of the body.
Well, I was just saying if maybe in 1,000 years from now when they're trying to recreate it and there's been some tectonic movement on the plates, they might have to get a new gravity model, but we'll let them worry about that.
That's true.
Not our problem.
All right. So let's see how many questions we answered in that little discussion. There's the question, how do you calculate longitude on the moon?
Cody, get a little closer to your mic there. It's dropping off just a little bit.
Yeah, I got to talk to the mic.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So that question, how do you calculate longitude on the moon? I think we covered that more or less. Anything we want to add to that?
One thing that we do now, with the I think I mentioned that we use a reference frame called the mean Earth reference frame to specify latitude and longitude for topographical information, so things like features on the moon. And that reference frame is based on the x-axis pointing in the mean direction towards the Earth, because the moon is tidally locked attitude-wise with respect to the Earth. It's always the same face of the moon that we see. But the moon actually has other fixed frames that are important as well, especially the frames called principal axis frames, which are aligned with the principal moments of inertia of the moon. And those are the ones that are actually used for the specification of lunar gravity and in the development of the solar system ephemerides. So we actually have some subtle distinctions there that are important when you want to talk about precise operations on the moon. And we have to be careful when we say latitude and longitude as exactly what lunar fixed frame we're talking about. There's a little bit of additional complication that we don't tend to have on the Earth when you go to the moon.
But once we have a fixed frame defined, then latitude and longitude are very similar to what we have on Earth.
Yes.
They're fixed in the surface.
Right, and the longitude being measured in an easterly fashion exactly like we do on the Earth.
So kind of just tacking on to that, then what reference system was adopted for landing on the moon, Austin?
For the actual lat longitude values, I just took the default for the moon, the latitude longitude values. In order to get those inside of Astrogator, you can access them under the results or in the component browser under the calculation objects, and they're under a folder called geodetic. There's the altitude, which takes by default the central body of the object, and then I created custom components that are always in reference to the moon. So that's how I was able to target the latitude and longitude of the moon. So I just took the default for there. But for something like the velocity with respect to the landing site, that was in the the moon fixed frame. There's about, as you can see over here on my left-hand side in this data display, there's about a 15 foot per second difference between the moon fix and the moon sort of inertial frame due to its rotation rate. So that also was pretty important for both landing, for splashdown when the astronauts re-entry, as well as the moon landing, using a fix to the Earth or a fix to the moon frame. And then for the angles, such as the horizontal flight path angle and the velocity azimuth, I use that B1950 frame. If you want to see the difference, I can show you the difference pretty easily. If I wanted to turn on, add in the moon axes, I can add in the moon B1950, as well as the, let's just do the inertial. And you can see that this moon B1950 and the moon inertial axes are different. So all those velocity azimuths were much more closely aligned to this B950. That might not have been the exact coordinate frame they used, but it was much more closely aligned than the default moon inertial. So I had to use that for the velocity azimuth.
Yeah, that's interesting because that would indicate, right, the B1950 frame is an Earth-centered frame that has been now translated to have its origin at the center of the moon. So that means that instead of using like what Austin is showing here as lunar inertial, which has its equator roughly with the fixed equator on the moon, that they just used a reference frame that had been built for Earth-based operations and translated it, which is absolutely a fine, valid thing to do. It's just not what we would do today.
That's interesting. It's also somewhat akin to the notion of you using geodetic components in the component browser when they're not really geodetic. And so maybe we can name those detic instead.
Yeah.
Mess up everybody's scripts and everything else.
Lunadetic. Yeah.
So.
Selenodetic.
Selenodetic.
All right.
Not to be confused with Selena Gomez, right?
Very different.
Very different. Okay.
Very different.
Just
don't
make sure
know.
they know that.
Good.
Right. One's more popular than the other. Right? Let you figure out which is which.
In the Apollo 11 mission report, they do specifically mention what reference frames they use, but without trying to go and recreate that inside of STK. It's up towards the top in here somewhere. I'm not going to find the exact page for you. But in the first couple pages, it does talk about what frames they use, but the closest one in STK would be by default would be the B1950.
Seems about right.
Austin, can you show what you were showing us earlier with the terrain that you found something interesting on?
Yes. So since the webinar last week, we got some slightly modified or improved imagery of the terrain of the moon landing. If I go ahead and jump to that. So during the webinar, I showed something more like this, which is a little bit. We had just a slightly different color for the terrain between my global moon terrain or imagery and my local moon imagery. And then we were able to get some slightly different imagery that is no longer as whitewashed and matches the global terrain a little bit better. And what you can see is what I used to originally land. If I zoom in here, we have this image of the Apollo 11 landing, as well as a couple key events that took place, such as where they planted the flag, where they performed some of the experiments.
That outline on the image is part of the image. Like someone marked that imagery with the outline of what would be the wireframe on the surface, right?
Can you say that one more time, Josh?
In the picture, below the model, that little thin line was part of the imagery to indicate where they said the landing was in that high resolution imagery.
Yeah, that's right, Josh.
So if you were to turn off the model, you would see that on the ground.
Yes. Right. Yes, that's a part of the actual imagery. So if I can pull up there we go. One thing we noticed is when we took this Apollo 11 traverse imagery off, that the landing location, it was actually slightly different than these two different images are slightly off. They're actually offset by a couple feet. And if you zoom in, also when I was trying to land, I noticed there's this little mound or this little bump right here that is just what I'm looking at right now, just to the right of where it actually landed by a few feet. And I wasn't sure what that was because when I watched the actual landing, I didn't see a mound.
The actual video footage didn't have a mound, right?
The actual video footage, I didn't see a mound. But what we noticed is when we turn this imagery on and off, it's actually shifted ever so slightly from this other imagery and terrain we have. And it's shifted by a couple feet in just the direction of this mound. So that shift would put this landing on the mound, which means that this mound more than likely is the actual descent module. So LRO, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is giving us this terrain imagery, actually captured the descent module that's still on the moon, this mound. It's about this height. Obviously, it's going to not be high enough resolution to get out all the little details, but you actually see the mound of the real descent module, I thought that was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
It's very cool.
Yeah, but it's gray, not gold.
It's just dirty. It's
there's a difference between imagery and terrain. The imagery is the nice, pretty colors, and the terrain would just be sort of the height.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't capture that. Sorry, Cody.
Okay. So I think you really answered this question kind of as you were discussing things, but one person did ask, out of curiosity, is your scenario interval set to the right date in 1969?
It is. It is set to the right date. It is set to July 16th of 1969 at 13:32 UTCG. So if I go and find... Let's change my units here. So if I go to my date format instead of mission elapsed time, I'm going to change this all to UTCG.
And I think that's actually kind of what prompted the question, was a little bit of lack of familiarity perhaps with the mission elapsed representation of the time as opposed to a date format.
Right. Yeah. So when they landed, It was the July 20th at 20 hours in prime meridian time, 17 minutes and 40 seconds, which is 4 hours, which is 4 hours ahead of Eastern Standard Time. So this would be 1600, which would put us at 4 p.m. If I'm doing my math correctly. Yeah, that put us at 4 p.m. On Eastern Standard Time on July 20th.
And if you hadn't done it in 1969, it would have been really hard to match their exact numbers.
Yes, you really couldn't unless you did it.
You could maybe get super lucky, but would have been next to
the,
impossible.
The moon and the Earth would have to be in similar relative geometry. So every 28 days or so, maybe I could get something close. But I had to do it pretty much when they did it to match all the values. Actually, Cody, what we were just talking about with the you don't get a nice gold color, but if I do turn off the descent module, this black spot is a discoloration of the actual landing. So I do believe they actually did pick up a little bit of discoloration for the actual landing itself.
You can see it when you step back, right? It's like one of those.
Yeah, if you stare at it long enough, it just pops out of the screen at you.
One of those magic eye.
There's calendar things that you get that just pops out.
All right, so that also led into another question, is the clock in the lower left corner mission time or simulation runs time, and that was the mission elapsed time, right?
Mission elapsed time, it would go days, hours, minutes, seconds, and then the actual, the mission elapsed time that they used back in 1969, it was just all hours. They didn't do the conversion to days, but it's all mission elapsed time. Yep.
All right, so maybe a little bit of a more theoretical question. And we talked about this during the webinar, but I think it's a really good discussion, and maybe we can repeat it a little bit. So this question is, which third body model is used? But I think, and at the time I also kind of interjected and said, can you talk a little bit about the models that you used? And so as you are leaving Earth and as you're getting closer to the moon, and sort of those different, how you model things along the way for the force model.
Okay, yeah, I can cover that, no problem. So if I go open up the properties of the service module, which is what I use for most of the propulsion, I used the Earth HPOP default for all of the up until they're getting close to the moon. After their first mid-course correction, I used the Earth HPOP, the default. And then after the mid-course correction, let me find that. When they're actually entering to do their lunar orbit insertion, then I switch to a moon default. And then while around the moon, I use moon default. And then once they come back for their once they leave, after the trans-Earth injection, I switch over after the second mid-course correction to a Earth HPOP. So when they're close to the moon, I use moon HPOP. When they're close to the Earth, I use Earth HPOP. And in both models, they are counting for, so in Earth HPOP, it's counting for the moon as a third body effect. It's just treating it as a point mass. And then when I'm close to the moon, it treats Earth as a point mass. So it's the gravity of the moon and Earth are being counted for the entire time. It's just at a higher resolution and fidelity when they're close to the Earth, and a higher fidelity when they're close to the moon.
Is it possible to just snap to those events and see where they are, like in the Earth-Moon frame? Like, are you halfway in between, or where's that happening?
So I don't have the sphere of influences drawn out, but when I switch gravity models, I am, in this case, I just happened to switch when it was sort of convenient. When I'm getting close to the moon, there wasn't really any burns that happen after the mid-course correction up until lunar orbit insertion. So this is lunar orbit insertion where they're coming in kind of for the first time. And if I look at this in the rotating frame.
Was this when you switched models, or you mentioned it was after the mid-course correction?
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be further back, right? Or is that
yeah, the mid-course correction, we can jump to that time. I'm only displaying a small fraction of the orbit right now. But But this is when I switch gravity models. It actually looks like I'm probably upside down with the way I'm typically looking at it. Would be right around when they entered the get close to the moon. The sphere of influence would be somewhere around here. The sphere of influence of the moon would be somewhere around here. So you could switch there. Alternatively, you could use the higher fidelity forces of the moon and Earth the entire way through. There's no reason you couldn't other than computational time. And it really wouldn't impact the trajectory, like where I switch exactly, very much.
Great.
What's HPOP?
HPOP, High Precision Orbit Propagator, is the acronym there. And if you want to go and investigate these more, if you want to go and inside the component browser under propagators, there are the Moon HPOP, the Earth HPOP, as well as all the other propagators. You can come in and see exactly what they're doing. In this case, it's a 48 by 48 gravity field. Solar radiation pressure and the sun and Earth are treated as point mass for Moon HPOP. And for Earth HPOP, it has a drag term in there as well. But that's not really relevant when I'm near the moon. And it treats the moon as a third body.
Right. And I think it's important to note that you chose force models that were convenient, right? They were available out of the box to be used, as opposed to, like, if we were doing this mission operationally today, right, we would configure something that's a little bit more high fidelity using more modern gravity models, especially for around the moon. We would swap in the Grail models, and in fact that's what we did, like on the Beresheet mission, was that the newer high fidelity models were used. But in this case, you're just matching rough data from a typewritten report, so you're not processing high precision tracking data or anything like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If we wanted to go into higher level fidelity, I could, as I just copied this Moon HPOP, and then I could come in here and then change out the gravity fields from different missions.
So that's the
Grail D.
Yeah, that's the 900 by 900 Grail gravity field. That was actually another question: is Grail gravity data available? And it is there.
So if we
and
wanted
you've
to,
used that operationally on a couple things, right? Or is that just the Beresheet mission, or use it on some of the other missions you were part of?
Well, we looked at it for Laddie, and I believe it was used in some post-mission analysis for Laddie, but during the lead up to Laddie, the Grail models weren't available yet, so we didn't use it operationally on that mission, just because, you know, kind of once you get locked into software and data sets and all, you don't just switch things. You just, you know, stick with what's working.
Right. And you were working on that with Mike Laux and John Carrico, who were with us a few times before on this. So
Correct.
A lot of overlap with what you guys were working on.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So just kind of a little bit of commentary, too, when we're talking about these default Earth or default Moon HPOP propagator settings. There really are a collection of settings that you can then go in and tweak yourself to increase fidelity or change. And we call them like Earth HPOP because those are to match settings from other pieces of the software that use the high precision orbit propagator. So the goal there is to provide consistency between other pieces of software, and that we call it HPOP.
And one of the other questions that came up in the thing, and we kind of had an answer for, was, are you going to give this scenario out? And just want to remind everybody, you're going to do 3 hours of training, where you can sign up for it on the website. If you're watching this and that training's already happened, just go to ajai.com/Apollo, and there'll be links to the videos there that you can watch them. But the question was, will you give out the scenario? And the answer is yes, we're going to give out the scenario, asterisk, with as much of this stuff that you're showing right now as possible, because there's some things through licensing issues, we don't want to redistribute models that we purchased but don't have license redistribution rights on and things like that. So we're going to give out this scenario eventually. We're just working out some of the kinks to make sure that we do it right and give you as much data as possible so that you can play around with this on your own time and investigate some of the panels that Austin was just bringing up there too.
And with that, we also want to try and avoid the what was it, 2 gigabytes of Get it smaller for people.
So when for the trajectories that we're going to go through in the next couple trainings, that file is megabytes in size. But in order to get all of the lunar terrain, so if I were to jump to, let's say, like the powered descent, you can see all this terrain in the background, see all the mountains as I'm flying in. All of that terrain I probably have like a third of the moon covered right now. There's probably like 20 gigs of terrain files. There's higher resolution imagery, which is what I'm using than the default, which is another gig. So in order to reduce all that file size, we'll give out a version of the scenario that doesn't have all these terrain pieces, but you'll get the trajectory, and we'll include as much as we can in the model.
And you could provide links to that terrain data if you want, because we got it from NASA anyway, right?
Yeah, we could post the terrain.
And if somebody else that had a high bandwidth could go get it if they wanted to.
We could post it, and someone could come and download it if they so desired.
Very cool. Most important question of the day is, what's your favorite space movie? Jim.
Oh, The Martian. Loved it. Except there was one.
You got to elaborate a little bit more than that.
Yeah, there was one major discrepancy in the film which really, really bothered me. Early in my career, I was an orbit analyst, and I've done quite a bit of trajectory work and navigation work. And when they depicted the guy at JPL who had that kind of role, he had a really large office. That's just not the case. No, we're shoved into very small cubicles. And, usually if the cubicle's not needed for empty boxes or something like that.
Sometimes you share it with the boxes.
With the boxes, yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Sometimes the boxes of our own making, so.
That's true. You can color on them and stuff like that. Use them as a whiteboard.
Make spaceships of your own.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cody, what's your favorite space movie?
So it's Apollo 13.
Apollo 13. All right, that's the second time that somebody here has said that.
Yeah, I know. I didn't. I watched the other.
Okay, so you're.
And then I was like, that's what Mike said, but
We'll keep a tally.
He stole my answer before I said my answer.
Yes, he did. So we'll keep a tally, right? So it's like Apollo 13 is winning, and what the best is. Austin, I don't think you answered this yet.
Mine, not to sound like cliche, but I think the most recent Apollo 11 film that came out, I really enjoyed that because it was all real footage, and I think that was the coolest part to me, to see that this was the actual footage that they shot. So I really enjoyed that. A close runner-up would be Interstellar. I liked Interstellar a lot.
Okay.
Probably Apollo 11.
That's good. That's a good one. All right, Cody, do you have any more questions on the list that we should probably tackle?
There are a few more.
I think we're running a bit long on time, but we could cut out some of the stuff. So let's go through it. Let's see what we got.
Okay. So the one that I really enjoyed during the webinar, and it's here, is just kind of the discussion of the figure 8 trajectory versus kind of what it's graphically depicted as and what it really looks like.
Okay, let's see if I can jump to that.
And the question while you're doing that is, why does the cislunar trajectory form a figure 8 rather than not just crossed big elliptical lines? And then I think you actually showed that it works the other way around. So.
Yeah, let's see if
Goldfish orbit.
A goldfish orbit, yeah. Let me just turn on all the trajectory lines instead of just for an hour and a half or so.
Yeah, well, and I think a big point of that is, right, that the trajectory is being displayed in an Earth-Moon rotating frame, right? So the Earth and the Moon are in constant locations. And so what would be an ellipse in inertial space is not an ellipse in this rotating frame.
And I think even so with the free return, if you're looking at it in inertial space, you would have an ellipse to get there, and then you'd be orbiting the moon, and then you'd have an ellipse to get back. But I think that the graphical sort of the things that these marketing folks always do, the pictures that they make.
I'm right here. I can hear you.
But the picture that they would typically show for like the Apollo missions and that figure 8 is kind of misleading, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not the full picture. They're usually, I guess, depictions or like graphical representations of what's happening opposed to what's actually happening. I'll go ahead and turn off the upper stage of the Saturn rocket, which flew by the moon, which would be this little piece that gets slung out. So this is the trajectory in the Earth-Moon rotating frame. So the the Saturn V launches. The first couple stages fall back to the Earth. The first 2 stages. The fourth stage actually does sling past the moon and get slung out, and it goes into a heliocentric orbit. But the crew goes on this figure 8 type thing. But once they hit the moon, they actually hit the moon on this far side over here. And during the course of their few days when they're orbiting the moon or on the moon's surface, the moon actually drifts closer to Earth. So that is why you see this blue, which is the orbit when they're around the moon, actually get closer. So this outer trajectory, it's like part of the figure 8, and then they spend a few days there. They're actually a little bit closer when they come back. And a lot of the depictions, this, I guess, sort of pinch in the figure 8 is closer to the moon. So this is the Earth-Moon rotating frame. It's usually a little bit close to the moon in this, or it's more symmetric, whereas in reality it's pretty tight on this towards the Earth, like this crossover point, and pretty wide out here in the moon in the actual Earth-Moon rotating frame instead of just a depiction.
Just anecdotally, at one point in my former life as a graduate student, we were asked to provide the picture, but the real picture of what the figure 8 looked like. And we had to respond and say, well, that there's no real picture. It either looks like this, or if you want to look at it inertially, the yellow and the green that you'd have there would be sections of an ellipse in inertial space.
Yeah, I can show that too, Cody. But yeah, this is sort of the typical picture you're going to see with the Earth orbits, and it comes over, the pinch is a little bit closer to the moon and comes back, or sometimes it'll be a little more symmetric. But all these representations don't really capture what's actually happening. So this is in the Earth-Moon rotating frame. If I wanted to look at this, let's say in the inertial frame, okay, so this is the camera pass a little off-centered here, but this is the trajectory in the inertial frame. So let's see if I can maybe rotate this guy just a little bit.
Right, and that's going to be an Earth-centered inertial frame, right? So the Earth is not moving.
Yeah, so this is the Earth-centered inertial frame. Basically, the crew orbits the Earth, they sling out, and then when they hit the moon, they get captured, and you see this kind of like corkscrew-looking thing. And this out trajectory is the upper stage of the Saturn rocket. This corkscrew thing, so this would be an inertial, like non-rotating space with respect to the Earth.
Yeah, I went on something like that at Hershey Park once.
How'd that work out?
Yeah, not so good.
And then they come back, and that would be a little bit more close to one of these depictions right here. Let's see if you can see that. Where they come out, they spin around the moon travels a distance, and then they come back. So this is what the actual trajectory looks like in an Earth inertial system.
It's always fun to look at orbits when you have multiple gravity fields. So you do see kind of the elliptical motion as you're departing Earth, but as you get closer to the moon, you can see it exerting its influence and pulling you in and kind of pulling the trajectory over. There were other questions, but I think we got all the good ones.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for taking a look at those. Thanks for taking the time to answer all of them. And don't forget to go to Austin's or watch Austin's training on this. And anybody have anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think Austin did an incredible job with this project, and it's something that people are going to be able to enjoy for a long time. So
yeah, it's pretty neat. We're going to be showing it down at the National Air and Space Museum on a big screen as the real event happens. This scenario that Austin created is going to be playing in real time, so that's going to be pretty cool. Probably try to get down there to see it happen, but we're pretty excited about that, and it's going to be.
Which real event is that?
When the anniversary real event, so in false time as if what happened today, right? We're
Accounting for leap seconds?
I don't know. Ask him. It's going to be exact, I'm sure. But thanks again. Thanks, guys. Maybe we'll all take a road trip down there together and check it out. That'd be pretty cool.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks, Josh.
Cody, you in?
Okay.
All right, cool. All right, thanks, everybody. See you next time. All right, we're out.